My name is Autumn, and at 33 years old, I thought I had survived the worst my family could throw at me. My sister called me at 7 in the morning to gleefully announce that our father was dead. She claimed he suffered a massive heart attack during the night, and that a newly discovered will left his entire multi-million-dollar logistics empire exclusively to her and her husband. Her husband even chimed in, laughing as he told me I was cut out of the family for good and would not receive a single cent. I did not panic or cry. I simply pressed the speakerphone button on my cell phone and set it down on the kitchen island. My father, who was sitting on the barstool right next to me, took a slow sip of his black coffee, leaned toward the microphone, and asked in a steady voice, "Then whose coffee am I drinking, Vanessa?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they could destroy you. Growing up in Seattle, Washington, I was always the family scapegoat. My mother, Susan, made sure of that. While Vanessa was paraded around as the perfect golden child, I was the quiet, analytical daughter who asked too many questions. I eventually moved out, put myself through college, and built a highly successful career as a forensic accountant. My father, William, was the only one who ever truly supported me, though my mother had spent years manipulating the family dynamics to keep us at a distance. He was the president of a highly lucrative logistics firm, a fact that had always kept my mother and sister hovering around him like vultures. The silence on the other end of the phone line was absolute. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the faint sound of Vanessa breathing heavily. Then, without a single word of explanation or apology, she ended the call. The dial tone echoed through my sunlit kitchen. I looked over at my father. He looked exhausted, the deep lines around his eyes more pronounced than usual, but his mind was as sharp as ever. To understand how we ended up sitting in my kitchen, confronting a fabricated death, you have to know what happened the night before. Yesterday evening, my father had suffered a mild allergic reaction to some new medication. It was nothing life-threatening, just a rash and some dizziness. As a precaution, he checked himself into the private hospital, where Derek worked as a senior hospital administrator. That was his first mistake. My father expected a simple observation period. Instead, Derek saw an opportunity. According to what my father told me when he showed up at my doorstep at 4 in the morning, Derek had intercepted his chart and isolated him in a private wing. Derek tried to push heavy sedatives, claiming my father was agitated and confused, but my father has always been fiercely observant. He pretended to swallow the pills, then spat them out the moment the nurse turned her back. Lying in that hospital bed, wide awake in the dark, my father overheard a hushed conversation in the hallway. Derek was on the phone with Vanessa. My father heard them discussing a plan to keep him heavily sedated, declare him mentally incompetent, and forge a new will transferring all his assets to them before eventually pulling the plug. They needed his money desperately, though my father did not yet know exactly why. The moment the hallway cleared, my father ripped out his intravenous line, put on his street clothes, and slipped out through a service exit. He flagged down a passing taxi and gave the driver my address. He came to me because he knew I was the only person in the family who could not be bought or manipulated by my mother or sister. Now, sitting in my kitchen with the morning sun streaming through the windows, the reality of their betrayal hung heavy in the air. My father stared at his coffee mug, his hands trembling slightly. It was not from the physical toll of the night, but from the realization that his own daughter and son-in-law had conspired to end his life for a payout. "I am so sorry, Dad," I said softly, reaching across the counter to place my hand over his. "You did not deserve to hear that from them." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "I spent my whole life trying to provide for them, Autumn. I let your mother poison the waters between us because I thought keeping the peace was the right thing to do. And this is how they repay me? By planning my funeral before I am even dead?" I stood up and walked over to the coffee maker to pour myself a fresh cup of coffee. We need to be smart about this. Derek is a high-ranking administrator at that hospital. If he is willing to fake medical records and declare you dead or incompetent, he likely has people on his payroll helping him. We need to contact my lawyer and get a protective order in place. Then I can start digging into Derek's digital footprint to find out why they are so desperate for your money right now. My father nodded, his expression hardening into the fierce, boardroom demeanor that had made him so successful. You are right. They think I am a confused old man they can easily dispose of. We are going to show them exactly how wrong they are. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my attorney. I needed to move fast before Derek realized my father was truly gone and tried to cover his tracks. But as the phone began to ring, I noticed something strange outside my kitchen window. A black police cruiser pulled up to the curb, parking aggressively across my driveway. Then another cruiser pulled up behind it, followed by an unmarked sedan. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "are we expecting anyone?" My father stood up, following my gaze out the window. The color drained from his face as we watched 4 uniformed officers step out of their vehicles. They did not look like they were here for a friendly wellness check. They moved with coordinated, urgent purpose, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Before I could even process what was happening, heavy, rhythmic pounding shook my front door. It was the kind of knock that demanded immediate compliance, vibrating through the floorboards of my quiet suburban home. Autumn Williams, a stern, booming voice shouted loudly from the front porch. "This is the Seattle Police Department. Open the door immediately. We have a warrant." My heart hammered against my ribs. I glanced at my father, who looked just as bewildered as I felt. I set my phone down on the counter, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked toward the entryway. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy wooden door open. 2 officers immediately stepped into the threshold. "You are under arrest for kidnapping an incapacitated elder," the taller one announced. They were taking my father back to the nightmare he had just escaped. The trap had officially been sprung, closing its cold steel jaws tightly around us. I stood frozen in my entryway as the 2 officers pushed past me. They did not have their weapons drawn, but their posture was aggressive, leaving no room for negotiation. The taller officer held up a piece of paper, a crisp, white document with the official letterhead of the private hospital where my brother-in-law, Derek, was an administrator. The officer declared that they were executing a medical retrieval order. He stated that my father, William, was a diagnosed dementia patient experiencing a severe psychotic break, and that I had unlawfully removed him from a secure medical facility against doctor's orders. I stared at the paper in absolute disbelief. It was a psychiatric hold certificate, fully signed and stamped by the hospital's chief of psychiatry. It claimed my father lacked the mental capacity to make his own decisions and required immediate, involuntary institutionalization. My father stepped forward, his hands raised peacefully. He spoke with the commanding, articulate voice of a man who had built a logistics empire from the ground up. He calmly told the officers that there had been a terrible mistake, that he was in perfect mental health, and that his son-in-law was attempting to hold him against his will. The officers barely listened. To them, my father was not a successful business owner. He was just a confused, elderly man in danger. One officer gently but firmly grabbed my father by the arm, telling him an ambulance was waiting outside to take him back to safety. I tried to step between them, demanding they let me call my lawyer, but the second officer physically blocked my path. He warned me that if I interfered with a medical rescue, I would be arrested for elder endangerment. The sheer audacity of the situation left me breathless. Derek had actually pulled it off. He had used his hospital connections to forge a psychiatric evaluation, effectively stripping my father of his basic human rights with a single piece of paper. Just as the paramedics brought a stretcher up my driveway, A silver luxury sedan screeched to a halt behind the police cruisers. The car door swung open, and my mother Susan rushed out. She was wearing a perfectly tailored designer trench coat, her hair immaculately styled despite the early hour. But her face was twisted into an exaggerated mask of sheer terror and grief. She ran past the officers and threw her arms around my father, sobbing loudly enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. She cried out, thanking God that he was safe, wailing about how worried she had been when she heard he had wandered off in his confused state. My father tried to push her away, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and betrayal. But the paramedics were already forcing him down onto the stretcher. Then my mother turned her sights on me. The performance she gave was worthy of an award. She covered her face with her hands, trembling violently as she told the police officers that she could not believe her own daughter would do something so malicious. She sobbed out a fabricated story, claiming that my accounting business was failing, that I was drowning in massive debt, and that I had dragged my sick, defenseless father out of his hospital bed in the middle of the night just to manipulate him into signing over his money. I tried to defend myself, raising my voice to tell the police that she was lying, but my mother pointed a manicured finger right at my face. Her voice grew shrill, dripping with years of barely concealed resentment. "You have always been jealous because Vanessa has a perfect marriage," she yelled her words, slicing through the crisp morning air. "When you were in college, you secretly moved out of the house because you simply could not stand to watch your sister succeed. You have always been a bitter, selfish girl. And now you are trying to kill your own father just to get your hands on his wealth before Vanessa does?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. It was the same toxic narrative she had been spinning for over a decade. Growing up, I was the black sheep who could never do anything right. While Vanessa was praised for every minor achievement, my accomplishments were dismissed or ignored. When I was 19, I had not moved out because I was jealous. I had fled because my mother had drained my college savings account to buy Vanessa a brand new luxury car as a graduation present. I had spent years working double shifts to pay for my own tuition, building my forensic accounting career from nothing, all while enduring my mother's constant, quiet, emotional abuse. She had always made sure I knew my place, and now she was weaponizing that fabricated family history to destroy my credibility in front of the police. The officers looked at me with undisguised disgust, clearly buying into the tragic story of a greedy, estranged daughter preying on her wealthy, incapacitated father. The taller officer sternly advised me to stay away from the hospital, warning that they would file a restraining order if I tried to interfere with my father's medical care again. I stood helplessly on my front porch as the paramedics strapped my father to the stretcher. His face was pale, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to him, but his eyes remained fiercely alert. As they rolled him past me toward the waiting ambulance, I stepped forward one last time, ignoring the officer's warning. I reached out to grab my father's hand, desperate to offer him some small measure of comfort. Our fingers locked together for just a fraction of a second. In that brief, chaotic moment, hidden by the bulky bodies of the paramedics and the blinding, flashing lights of the police cruisers, I felt something hard and metallic press into the center of my palm. My father's fingers squeezed mine tightly, pushing the small object deep into my grip before the paramedic physically separated us. I immediately curled my hand into a fist, dropping my arm to my side and sliding my hand into the deep pocket of my cardigan. My father did not say a word. He just held my gaze with a burning intensity as they loaded him into the back of the ambulance and slammed the heavy door shut. My mother wiped her fake tears, gave me one final look of absolute triumph, and got back into her silver sedan. She drove away following the ambulance and the police escort down the street, leaving me completely alone on my porch. I did not waste a single second. I ran inside, grabbed my keys, and raced to my vehicle, my mind reeling with terrifying possibilities. If Derek committed my father under a psychiatric hold, he could force him to sign fraudulent documents. I arrived at the private medical center 20 minutes later, sprinting toward the psychiatric wing. 2 large security guards stepped into my path. One held up a clipboard containing my photograph. He informed me the patient's legal next of kin had banned me from the premises. If I did not leave immediately, I would be arrested. I was completely isolated and powerless against Derek's authority. Defeated, I backed away and walked outside. The morning air was cold as I stood alone outside the hospital. I felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over me. But as I shoved my trembling hands into my cardigan pockets, my fingers brushed against the small metallic object my father had slipped to me. I pulled it out and opened my palm. Resting in the center of my hand was a small, encrypted black USB drive. I stared at the tiny hardware, my heart hammering against my ribs. The cold metal absorbed the warmth of my trembling palm. My father had not lost his mind. He had been preparing for a war, and he had just handed me the weapon that could save him. I closed my fist tightly around the drive, shoved it deep into my pocket, and sprinted to my car. I locked the doors the moment I slid into the driver's seat. Everything my mother and sister orchestrated outside my home was a theatrical performance designed to isolate my father and discredit me. They did not know about this drive. I forced myself to take a deep breath, channeling the analytical focus that made me one of the top forensic accountants in Seattle. Panic would not help my father. Data would. I drove back to my apartment with my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see police cruisers or Derek's private security tailing me. The streets of Seattle were fully awake now, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in my life. When I finally reached my building, I parked in the underground garage and took the stairs to my floor. Once inside my apartment, I bolted the door, engaged the deadbolt, and pulled the blinds shut. The silence offered a temporary illusion of safety, but I knew the clock was ticking. I walked straight into my home office and booted up my primary workstation. This was an isolated laptop I used strictly for highly sensitive financial investigations. I plugged the black USB drive into the port and waited. A prompt immediately flashed on my screen, demanding a 32-character cryptographic key. It was military-grade encryption. Derek and my mother might have thought my father was just a wealthy logistics owner, but William had always been fiercely protective of his corporate data. I stared at the password prompt, my mind racing through possibilities. My father slipped this to me in sheer desperation, knowing I would be the only one who could open it. It had to be something impossible for others to guess. I closed my eyes and thought about the rare, quiet moments we shared away from my mother's toxic influence. I typed in the address of his very first logistics warehouse, followed by the date he incorporated his company, and finally, my own middle name. It was a combination he had once jokingly called his 3 greatest investments. I hit the enter key and held my breath. The screen went black for a second, before a loading bar appeared, turning green as the decryption software accepted the key. A folder popped up on my desktop, labeled Medical Equipment Procurement. I clicked the folder open, and my screen was instantly flooded with hundreds of documents. There were offshore bank statements, internal hospital budget reports, wire transfer logs, and encrypted email threads. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the spreadsheets with practiced speed. The numbers told a story that was devastatingly clear. This had nothing to do with my father's health. This was about covering up a massive financial crime. I opened a master spreadsheet detailing the hospital's procurement budget for the last 3 years. Derek had sole authorization over purchasing high-end medical scanning equipment. According to official hospital ledgers, he had been buying state-of-the-art machines from a supplier based in Europe. But when I cross-referenced the supplier's routing numbers with the wire transfer logs my father compiled, the truth glared back at me. The European supplier did not exist. It was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands.
Derek had been generating fake invoices, approving payments through the hospital's automated financial system, and funneling the money directly into offshore accounts he controlled. I rapidly calculated the diverted funds across multiple columns. The total was staggering. Over 36 months, Derek had systematically embezzled exactly $4 million from the private hospital's medical equipment fund. My mind worked furiously to connect the remaining dots. Why the sudden move to institutionalize my father last night? Why risk everything with a fake psychiatric hold? I opened the next file. It was a scanned copy of an internal hospital memo dated 2 days ago. The memo announced a comprehensive federal audit of all medical procurement grants scheduled to begin on the 1st of next month. The hospital had recently received federal funding, triggering a mandatory investigation by government auditors. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. The federal auditors would tear through Derek's fake invoices in a matter of hours. They would trace the missing $4 million, and Derek would face decades in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud. He was completely trapped. His only way out was to replace the $4 million before the auditors arrived in 3 weeks. But Derek did not have that kind of money. He lived an expensive lifestyle, funding Vanessa's luxury shopping habits and maintaining the illusion of immense wealth. They were broke, living on credit and stolen hospital funds. He needed a massive influx of untraceable cash immediately. My father's logistics company was the perfect target. If Derek could get my father declared mentally incompetent, Vanessa could petition the court for emergency conservatorship. With legal control over my father's assets, Derek and Vanessa could liquidate enough of his stock portfolio to cover the stolen $4 million, doctor the hospital books, and walk away clean. They were sacrificing my father's freedom to save Derek from prison. A cold, profound anger washed over me, replacing the fear that had been gripping my chest all morning. They had underestimated me. My mother had convinced them that I was just a bitter outcast who would crumble under pressure. They had no idea that my father and I had just checkmated them. I had absolute proof of Derek's embezzlement. This USB drive was the silver bullet that would free my father, send Derek to federal prison, and expose Vanessa's complicity. I grabbed a secondary encrypted flash drive from my desk drawer and quickly made 2 backup copies of the entire folder. I shoved one copy into my safe and slipped the other into my jacket pocket. I needed to get to the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Division immediately. Once I handed over these documents, Derek's fake psychiatric hold would crumble, and the police would storm that hospital to arrest him. I grabbed my car keys from the desk and turned to head toward the door. My cell phone suddenly vibrated violently in my pocket. It was a continuous buzzing, indicating an emergency alert. I pulled the phone out. Instead of just a threatening message from my mother, my screen lit up with high-priority notifications from my primary bank. I swiped open the banking application. A bright red banner displayed across the dashboard read, "Account access suspended." I tapped the notification, my pulse quickening. My checking account, business savings, and emergency funds all showed an available balance of $0. Another notification stated that my financial assets had been frozen pursuant to a court-ordered asset freeze. A court order? I quickly opened my email and found the notice. The petitioner was Vanessa. She had used the fabricated story of my financial desperation to convince a judge I was draining my father's accounts. By freezing my money, she effectively cut off my ability to hire a lawyer or fund an investigation. I was now completely financially paralyzed. The bank freeze did not change the evidence already copied onto 2 encrypted drives, and it did not stop me from moving. I photographed the court notice, preserved the email headers, and forwarded both to the attorney whose number I had tried to reach before the police arrived. Then I shut down the banking application and opened a clean case log. Every action Vanessa took would now be time-stamped beside Derek's financial records.
If they wanted to build a false story about my desperation, I would answer it with a documented chronology. A new message arrived before I could leave for the Financial Crimes Division. The subject line read, "Property Transfer Notice." Vanessa claimed that because William had been declared incapacitated, she now controlled his estate. Attached was a supposed last will naming her and Derek as the sole beneficiaries, along with a demand that I vacate my home by the end of the week. My father had co-signed the mortgage 5 years earlier, so his name remained on part of the deed. Vanessa was trying to use that technical interest as a lever, betting that the frozen accounts and the threat of eviction would force me to surrender before I could challenge her. I saved the message, downloaded the attachment into an isolated folder, and added its transmission data to my case log. The forged will was not merely another family threat, it was the first document connecting their hospital scheme directly to the theft of real property. I opened the attachment and scrutinized the pages. According to this supposed legal document, my father had revoked all previous trusts and designated Vanessa and Derek as the sole beneficiaries and executors of his entire estate. The document specifically targeted the house I was currently living in. When I purchased this home 5 years ago, my father had co-signed the mortgage to help me secure a better interest rate, meaning his name was technically still on the deed. The forged will claimed that upon his incapacitation or death, his share of all real estate holdings immediately transferred to Vanessa. Her email demanded that I pack my belongings and vacate the premises by the end of the week so they could prepare the property for sale. I leaned closer to the monitor, my trained eyes catching every glaring flaw in the document. The legal phrasing was clumsy and outdated, likely cobbled together from generic internet templates. The margins were misaligned, and the notary stamp looked pixelated, as if it had been copied and pasted from another file. But the most damning detail was the signature. It mimicked the broad strokes of my father's handwriting, but it lacked the fluid, confident pressure he applied to his pen. The loops were hesitant and forced. It was an amateur forgery, executed in a desperate hurry. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of my sister's crime, my phone began ringing loudly on the desk. The caller identification showed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a steadying breath before pressing the answer button. I did not say a word, waiting for her to speak first. "Autumn, you need to listen to me carefully," Susan said. Her voice was completely devoid of the hysterical tears she had just performed for the police an hour ago. She sounded brisk, businesslike, and utterly heartless. "Vanessa sent you the documents. We need you out of that house immediately." I stared at the forged signature on my computer screen. "Mom, Dad is not even dead. He is sitting in a hospital under heavy sedation. You cannot enforce a will for a man who is still breathing." "Do not play semantics with me," she snapped, her tone dripping with venom. "Your father is gone. His mind is completely gone, and he is never coming back from that psychiatric ward. The medical bills are going to be astronomical, and we have to start making arrangements for his final expenses. We need liquid cash right now to cover the funeral preparations and the estate taxes. Vanessa and Derek are stepping up to handle the heavy burdens of this family, as they always do. The least you can do is cooperate and hand over the property." The sheer depravity of her words sent a chill down my spine. She was talking about my father as if he were already a corpse in the ground, liquidating his life while his heart was still beating across town. They were not trying to pay for medical bills or a funeral. My father had premium health insurance and millions in accessible corporate accounts. They needed untraceable cash, and they needed it fast enough to bypass standard corporate scrutiny. Selling my house was a quick, dirty way to inject a massive amount of money directly into their own pockets. "You want me to just pack up and hand over my home?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately soft, making myself sound defeated. "You owe us this autumn," she demanded, mistaking my quiet tone for submission. "You have been nothing but a disappointment to this family. You never cared for him the way Vanessa did.
Let your sister manage the assets. She knows what she is doing. If you try to fight this in court, Derek will use the hospital's legal team to bury you in litigation fees until you are bankrupt. Sign the transfer deed by tonight, or we will have the sheriff forcibly evict you by Friday."
She did not wait for my response. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in the silence of my office. For a long moment, I simply stared at the blank phone screen. Any ordinary person would have panicked. Any normal daughter would have broken down in tears, called a lawyer, and fought tooth and nail to keep her home and protect her father. But I was not just a grieving daughter. I was a forensic accountant who tracked financial fraud for a living, and I had just been handed the most spectacular gift my enemies could possibly offer. If I fought the eviction, it would tie us up in civil court for months. It would become a tedious dispute over property rights and medical competency. But if I surrendered the house, if I willingly signed the property over to Vanessa based on this fabricated will, the situation would instantly escalate from a family dispute into a major federal crime. The moment Vanessa signed the closing documents to sell a house using a forged will across state banking lines, she would be committing massive real estate fraud and wire fraud. She would be wrapping a federal noose around her own neck and handing me the end of the rope. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The burning anger in my chest transformed into a cold, brilliant clarity. They thought they were bullying a helpless outcast into submission. They had no idea they were walking blindly into a lethal trap. I reached into my pocket and set my father's encrypted USB drive on the desk right next to my phone. I would decode his secrets soon enough, but first, I had a performance to deliver. I opened a new email draft addressed to Vanessa. I kept my typing slow and deliberate, crafting a message that sounded appropriately terrified and broken. I told her that I could not afford a lengthy legal battle against Derek's hospital lawyers. I told her that I was packing my bags and would leave the keys on the kitchen counter. I printed out the property relinquishment forms she had attached. I picked up my favorite blue ink pen and smoothly signed my name on the dotted line, officially surrendering my home to my sister. I scanned the signed documents and hit send. I watched the progress bar slide across the screen, confirming the email had been delivered to Vanessa's inbox. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the digital confirmation. The bait had been taken. My sister had just stolen a house, and I was going to let her sell it. The next 48 hours moved with a terrifying, breathless velocity. I did not pack a single box. I simply booked a quiet hotel room across town, packed a small overnight bag, and left my keys exactly where I promised on the marble kitchen island. I drove away from the house I had purchased with my own hard-earned money, leaving it vulnerable to my sister's greed. Before I pulled out of the driveway, my phone buzzed. Vanessa texted, hoping I found a nice affordable apartment, claiming our father's psychiatric care would be incredibly expensive. My mother chimed in quickly, praising Vanessa for stepping up to handle the estate during such a tragic time. I read their messages with a profound sense of detachment. I set up my mobile workstation in the hotel suite, connecting to a secure virtual private network. From there, I monitored the public real estate registry and my father's corporate shareholder portal. Vanessa and Derek wasted absolutely no time. By Tuesday morning, my house was listed on an exclusive off-market real estate network designed for rapid cash-only transactions. They were pricing it 20% below market value to ensure an immediate sale. They did not stop with my property. Using the fraudulent conservatorship documents and the forged will, they had convinced a local judge to temporarily validate Vanessa, initiated a transfer of a massive block of my father's logistics company shares. My father had spent 40 years building his logistics empire. It started with a single delivery truck and grew into a massive fleet servicing the entire West Coast. The shares Vanessa was attempting to sell were not just pieces of paper. They represented a lifetime of sweat, sleepless nights, and relentless dedication. Transferring those shares required overriding strict corporate bylaws. To bypass these protections, Vanessa and Derek had used the forged psychiatric hold to compel an emergency injunction from a sympathetic judge. They painted a picture of a failing company that desperately needed a cash injection to survive its founder's sudden mental decline. The lies were elaborate and deeply offensive, stripping my father of his dignity in the public record. But their rush to bypass standard protocols meant they were leaving a blatant paper trail of perjury and fraud. They were moving so fast that they failed to realize they were essentially gift wrapping the evidence I would eventually hand over to the federal authorities. I knew Derek was the one driving the frantic pace of this sale. As a hospital administrator, he understood the devastating power of a federal audit. The auditors would trace every single purchase order, every invoice, and every offshore wire transfer. He was terrified. I could imagine the tension in their household, the sleepless nights, the arguments masked by their pristine public image. Derek needed that $4 million replaced immediately, and he did not care who he had to destroy to get it. He was perfectly willing to throw my father into a psychiatric ward and render me homeless to save his own skin. It was a cowardly, despicable strategy, and it fueled my determination to see this through to the bitter end. They needed a buyer who would not ask questions, someone willing to drop millions in liquid cash without requiring tedious inspections or standard corporate disclosures. They thought they found the perfect mark when an anonymous commercial holding firm submitted a full-price, all-cash offer for both the house and the logistics shares within 2 hours of the listings going live. The holding firm waived all contingencies and promised to wire the funds by Thursday afternoon. Vanessa and Derek accepted the offer immediately, completely blinded by their own desperation and arrogance. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. When I first started my career as a forensic accountant navigating the high-stakes world of corporate fraud, I learned very quickly how to protect my own assets. I knew my mother would eventually try to bleed me dry to fund Vanessa's lavish lifestyle, so I made sure my wealth was entirely invisible to them. 5 years ago, I established an irrevocable blind trust registered in Wyoming, a state known for its impenetrable corporate privacy laws. I funneled all my high-level consulting fees, bonuses, and private investments into that trust. Over the years, it had grown into a formidable financial entity, managed by an independent trustee who followed my precise, encrypted instructions. When I saw Vanessa list my house and my father's shares, I sent a single secure message to my trustee. I authorized the immediate purchase of both assets using the liquid capital I had accumulated. Vanessa and Derek thought they were selling off my father's life's work to a faceless corporate conglomerate. In reality, they were selling my own house back to me and handing my father's stolen company shares directly into my impenetrable, legally protected vault. They were doing all the heavy lifting to securely transfer my father's wealth, entirely out of their own reach. I sat in my hotel room, sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the digital transaction process unfold on my encrypted monitor. My sister's greed was a predictable, easily manipulated algorithm. She was so focused on saving her husband from a federal prison sentence that she did not even bother to have a lawyer properly vet the anonymous holding company purchasing the assets. If she had done even a basic background check, she might have noticed the holding firm shared a registered agent with my own accounting practice. But Vanessa had always believed she was the smartest person in the entire room, and my mother had spent a lifetime reinforcing that extremely dangerous delusion to her. By early Thursday morning, the final digital closing documents were officially generated by a rapid escrow service. Because Derek needed the money transferred into his offshore shell company before the hospital auditors arrived, they opted for a fully remote electronic closing. This was the final, fatal mistake. To finalize a remote real estate and corporate equity transfer, the documents had to be transmitted across state lines, utilizing federal banking networks to clear the multi-million-dollar transaction. I watched the escrow portal's live tracking system, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. The screen refreshed, indicating that the seller had accessed the secure document portal. I pictured Vanessa sitting in her immaculate living room, perhaps with Derek hovering anxiously over her shoulder, both of them believing they had just pulled off the perfect crime. They probably thought they were finally free, completely unaware that the federal government considers the electronic transmission of fraudulent financial documents to be one of the most serious white-collar crimes in the country. The progress bar on my screen shifted. A green checkmark appeared next to the property deed transfer. Another green checkmark appeared next to the corporate shareholder reassignment form. The final prompt asked for the seller's verified electronic signature to execute the wire transfer and finalize the sale. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, the silence of the hotel room wrapping around me. The system buffered for a fraction of a second, then a bold digital confirmation flashed across my monitor. Transaction complete. The funds were locked in escrow, and the signed documents were permanently recorded on the federal banking server. Vanessa's verified signature was now officially on the binding contract. By eagerly finalizing that fraudulent sale across a digital network, my sister had just unequivocally committed federal wire fraud. The moment Vanessa's electronic signature appeared on the closing portal, I downloaded the complete audit trail. I preserved the IP address, the identity verification record, the forged deed, the shareholder transfer, and the instructions directing the expected proceeds toward Derek's offshore company. Then I opened the secure whistleblower portal, maintained by the hospital board's outside counsel. I did not send accusations or emotional explanations. I submitted a concise forensic package, 12 representative invoices. The matching wire records the Cayman routing information, the federal audit notice, and a transaction map showing exactly how $4 million had vanished from the medical equipment fund. I added a preservation request, warning that Derek still possessed administrative access and could destroy evidence if the board delayed. I signed the submission with an encrypted case number instead of my name. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the portal status changed from received to under emergency review. Another notification followed, confirming that outside counsel had downloaded every attachment. I watched the hospital's public executive directory in a second browser window. Derek's name remained beneath the title Senior Administrator, but the link to his profile suddenly stopped working. His hospital email rejected a test message. 5 minutes later, the board issued an internal compliance alert, placing him on immediate administrative suspension, revoking his physical badge, freezing his procurement authority, and directing information technology staff to preserve his devices. The response was faster than I expected. My evidence had landed in a room full of people who understood that delaying could expose the hospital itself to federal liability. The anonymous portal chimed again. Outside counsel requested a secure call with the whistleblower. I declined for the moment and uploaded one additional file, the forged psychiatric certificate used to seize my father. I highlighted the creation metadata, showing that the document had been generated from Derek's home network before William ever entered the hospital. That turned a financial investigation into an immediate patient safety crisis. The board notified its independent compliance physician and placed every order involving my father under review. Derek had wanted the hospital to be his shield. In less than an hour, it had become another institution collecting evidence against him. The suspension triggered consequences beyond Derek's office. The hospital's chief financial officer ordered a hold on every payment connected to his procurement vendors. Security personnel sealed his records room, while outside counsel instructed staff not to contact him. A board member issued a statement saying an administrator had been removed during an investigation into financial irregularities and patient safety concerns. The statement did not name my father, but Seattle's business community noticed. 2 investors withdrew from Vanessa's gala before dinner, and a lender paused her company's credit line. Their public image was cracking before either of them understood how much evidence had surfaced. My phone rang from Vanessa's number just after sunset. I answered without speaking and started a lawful recording through my case management system. Derek's voice exploded through the speaker before my sister could say a word. He accused me of sabotaging the hospital, stealing the buyer behind their sale, and trapping the proceeds in escrow. The trust's title counsel had refused to release the money until the sellers proved that William had validly authorized the transfers. Because they could not produce a competent witness or an authentic power of attorney, the multi-million-dollar payment remained locked beyond their reach. "You think this is a game?" Derek shouted. "The board took my badge. They seized my office computer. Federal auditors will have everything by morning. Release the escrow money now, or your father will never walk out of that ward." His threat stripped away the last pretense that William's confinement was medical. I kept my voice flat. "You just admitted that my father's release is tied to money you stole. Say it again, slowly." Vanessa grabbed the phone. "Do not twist his words, Autumn. You caused this. You were supposed to disappear after signing the house over. Instead, you used some secret company to humiliate us. Fix the transfer and maybe we can still handle Dad's care privately." A crash sounded in the background, followed by Susan's frightened voice. She demanded that Derek lower his voice before the neighbors heard. Then, astonishingly, she turned on Vanessa. She said a good wife protected her husband's reputation. That Vanessa should have checked. The buyer controlled me and kept the family scandal from reaching the board. Derek seized on the criticism. He called Vanessa careless and useless. He shouted that her rushed forgery had created the title problem and that her gala would collapse if investors learned he had been suspended. For the first time, the perfect couple stopped performing. Vanessa screamed that she had risked her license, her company, and her relationship with William to save Derek. She reminded him that the hospital theft was his idea and that she had only sold the property because he promised the missing money could be replaced before anyone noticed. Derek answered that promises meant nothing if she could not deliver cash. Susan tried to calm them by repeating that families solved problems together. Vanessa laughed at her. "Together," Vanessa said. "You mean everyone gives me what I need while you call it family? Autumn got the career, Dad kept the company, you kept your retirement account, while Derek and I carried the image of this family. Do not lecture me about sacrifice." Susan sounded stunned. "That money is all I have," she whispered. I heard a sudden silence on the line. It lasted only a second, but I understood what had changed. Vanessa had just remembered the broad power of attorney Susan signed during knee surgery the previous year. Susan had trusted her golden child with access to medical bills and bank accounts, never imagining that the authority could be turned against her. Derek understood at the same moment. His voice became low and urgent. He asked how quickly the funds could be moved and whether the bank would question an offshore transfer. Susan began protesting, but Vanessa ended the call. I immediately documented the threat and sent the recording to my attorney, with instructions to preserve it. I could not access Susan's bank or stop a transaction she had voluntarily authorized through a valid power of attorney. I did, however, send her one warning text. "Revoke Vanessa's authority tonight. Call your bank's fraud department now. Do not sign or approve anything." The message showed as delivered. Susan did not answer. Pride had always made her more afraid of admitting Vanessa was dangerous than of the danger itself. At 8 the next morning, my attorney confirmed that the hospital had referred Derek's procurement activity to federal investigators. At 8:15, the escrow company froze the sale proceeds pending a fraud review. At 8:23, Susan's bank recorded a transfer of her entire retirement balance into an offshore account controlled by Derek. Vanessa had used the old power of attorney presented herself as the dutiful daughter managing an emergency and emptied decades of savings in a single transaction. They had finally begun devouring one another. Derek had lost his position. Vanessa had exposed herself through the forged sale. Susan had sacrificed her last protection to the child she had spent a lifetime defending. I closed the case log and stared at the clock. I knew it would not take long before my mother arrived at my door, demanding that I repair the disaster she had helped create. I had barely settled into my temporary apartment when the frantic pounding started. The knocking was sharp and desperate. I checked the security monitor. Standing in the hallway was my mother, Susan. She looked nothing like the immaculately styled woman who weaponized a false narrative against me just days ago. Her designer coat was wrinkled, her hair a mess, and her mascara smudged. She trembled violently, clutching her leather handbag as if it were a life preserver. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. My mother did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past me, practically collapsing into the entryway. She was gasping for air, her face pale. I closed the door and waited. I wanted to hear her say the words. "She is gone," my mother sobbed. "Vanessa is completely out of control." Derek came home in an absolute rage after the hospital suspended him. He was screaming about an audit and pacing the floors. He told Vanessa they were going to lose everything and might go to federal prison. He said they needed millions in untraceable cash immediately to hire a defense team and flee. I crossed my arms, my expression remaining neutral. "And what does that have to do with you?" I asked. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with horrific realization. "She took my retirement fund, Autumn. She took everything. I went to the bank this morning, and the teller told me my accounts were empty. Vanessa had me sign a power of attorney document last year when I had my knee surgery. I forgot about it. She used it this morning. She walked into my bank and drained my entire life savings. She transferred it all to an offshore account Derek controls, and neither is answering my calls." I felt a brief flash of amusement. The irony was poetic. My mother spent her entire life shielding Vanessa from consequences, treating her like a flawless golden child. Now that same golden child cannibalized her own mother the moment true desperation set in. Vanessa and Derek were cornered animals, feeding on the person who enabled their entitlement. "I am sure Vanessa will return it once things finally settle down," I said, allowing a trace of cold sarcasm to thread through my words. "She is the perfect daughter, after all." My mother did not catch the sarcasm. Instead, she lunged forward, grabbing my forearms with a bruising grip. "Autumn, you must help us," she pleaded. "You are a successful accountant. You know how these financial systems work. You have to find a way to pay off Derek's debt to the hospital. You need to write a check to make this federal audit disappear. If Derek goes to prison, Vanessa's life will be completely destroyed. She will lose her reputation, her real estate license, everything. You have to save your sister." I stared down at her hands, gripping my arms. Slowly, deliberately, I peeled her fingers off my skin and took a step back. The breathtaking audacity of her demand echoed in the quiet apartment. After forging a will freezing my assets, attempting to steal my home, and leaving my father to rot in a psychiatric ward, she honestly expected me to liquidate my hard-earned wealth to rescue the people who just tried to destroy my life? "You want me to pay off a $4 million embezzlement debt to save Vanessa?" I asked. "You want me to fulfill my duty to this family to keep the peace?" "Yes," my mother cried out, nodding eagerly, completely oblivious to the danger in my tone. "We are family, Autumn. We have to stick together in times of crisis. You have money hidden away. I know you do. It is your obligation to help your family when we are facing ruin. If you just fix this for Vanessa, we can all go back to normal. I promise that I will make sure she is grateful." I let out a low, humorless laugh. My gaze hardened, stripping away any lingering trace of daughterly affection. "Normal?" I asked. "Do you mean the kind of normal where you treat me like a disposable asset? Let us talk about family obligations, Mom? Let us talk about what happened when I was 19 years old?"
My mother stiffened her tears, pausing, as a flash of guilty recognition crossed her features. I worked 2 jobs during high school. I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous steady rhythm. I saved every penny I earned for 3 years because I wanted to go to a good university. I trusted you to hold that money in a joint savings account. But when Vanessa graduated, she threw a massive temper tantrum because she wanted a luxury sports car to impress her sorority friends. And what did you do, Mom? Autumn, that was a long time ago, she stammered, taking a small step backward. We needed to make sure your sister had reliable transportation. You were always so resilient. I knew you could figure out another way to pay for school. You stole my future to buy her a status symbol, I stated, the cold truth hanging heavily between us. You walked into the bank, drained my college fund, and handed it to Vanessa, wrapped in a bright red bow. I had to take out crippling student loans. I pulled all night shifts at a diner just to afford my accounting textbooks. You did not care if I drowned as long as your golden child had a shiny new toy. And now you are begging me to bankrupt myself to save her from a federal prison sentence? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks again. I am your mother. You cannot just turn your back on me. I have nothing left. Vanessa took everything I had. And she learned that behavior from you, I replied, showing absolutely no mercy. You taught her that taking what belongs to others is perfectly acceptable as long as it serves her own needs. You created a monster, and now you are upset because the monster finally turned around and bit you? You made your choice decades ago, Mom. You chose Vanessa. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. My mother realized that her demands and maternal authority were completely useless. In a final, desperate attempt at emotional manipulation, her knees buckled. She dropped straight down onto the hardwood floor. She collapsed into a weeping, pathetic heap, clutching at the hem of my trousers. She sobbed violently, begging me to remember the good times, pleading for mercy, insisting she would be homeless if I did not force Vanessa to return the stolen funds. She used every weapon in her arsenal, the tears, the guilt, the desperation. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and unloved. I searched my heart for even a single ounce of pity, a sliver of familial duty, or a trace of the desperate little girl who used to crave her approval. There was absolutely nothing there. The well was completely dry. I stepped back, forcing her to release my clothes. I looked down at her with total, unbreakable indifference. You should probably go call a lawyer, I said, my voice as cold and hard as solid ice. Because I am not giving you a single dime, and neither is your favorite daughter. I reached for the heavy wooden door, gripped the handle tightly, and swung it open. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her control over me was permanently gone. I stepped back, letting the reality of her shattered world sink in, and then I slammed the door shut right in her face. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. The steel boundary was officially established. I stood in the quiet hallway of my temporary apartment, listening to my mother's retreating footsteps. The finality of the slamming door echoed in my chest, leaving behind a profound stillness. For my entire life I had craved her approval, twisting myself into knots to be seen as something more than a disappointment. Now, looking at the heavy wooden door that separated us, I felt absolutely nothing but a hollow sense of relief. I had finally severed the toxic anchor that had dragged me down for over 30 years. But my moment of reflection was a luxury I could not afford. Susan was collateral damage in a war that was far from over. My father William was still trapped in a heavily guarded psychiatric ward, completely at the mercy of my brother-in-law. Derek was a desperate man backed into a corner by his impending federal audit and his sudden suspension by the hospital board. Desperate men made fatal mistakes, and I needed to extract my father before Derek decided a tragic medical accident was his only remaining way out. I walked back to my desk, my mind shifting entirely from family grief to tactical execution. I returned to my secure workstation and cracked my knuckles. It was time to go on the offensive. Derek had used his administrative authority to strip my father of his basic rights, but Derek was fundamentally a hospital bureaucrat, not a cybersecurity expert. I plugged the encrypted black USB drive back into my computer. The financial records my father had gathered were not the only valuable assets on that drive. To compile those wire transfer logs, my father had paid someone to quietly scrape the hospital's internal network directory. I opened a subfolder containing the hospital's digital infrastructure maps and administrative login protocols. I launched a specialized decryption program using the network architecture to bypass the hospital's external firewall. I did not need to access the main patient database, which would be heavily monitored. I only needed to breach the internal communication system of the psychiatric wing. I quickly located the specific room number where my father was being held. The private suites in that high-security wing were equipped with integrated smart monitors designed for doctors to conduct remote telehealth evaluations for dangerous patients. The system was supposed to be secure, but the network relied on outdated administrative credentials that had not been updated in months. I initiated a remote override sequence. The screen flickered, and suddenly a grainy, wide-angle video feed appeared on my monitor. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale light of the hallway filtering under the heavy door. I adjusted the contrast on my screen. My father was lying on the narrow hospital bed. His breathing was shallow, his posture unnaturally stiff. I activated the two-way audio protocol, routing it through a secure proxy to prevent any chance of the signal being traced back to my hotel room. "Dad," I whispered into my microphone, keeping my voice as low and steady as possible. "Dad, can you hear me?" For a terrifying moment, he did not move. Then slowly, his head turned toward the monitor mounted on the wall. He blinked heavily, fighting through the thick haze of the sedatives they had forced into his system. "Autumn." His voice was thick, slurring slightly, but the fierce intelligence in his eyes remained entirely unbroken. He propped himself up on one elbow, gripping the metal bed rail to steady his trembling frame. "Are you safe?" "I am safe," I promised, feeling a sudden sharp sting of tears at his unwavering protective instinct. He was locked in a psychiatric hold, drugged and isolated, yet his first question was about my safety. "I secured your shares and the house. Vanessa and Derek played right into our trap. I also found the procurement files on the drive. Derek is suspended. The board is looking into the embezzlement right now." A faint, triumphant smile touched my father's lips. "Good girl. I knew you would catch them. But we have a serious problem," I continued, my fingers flying across my keyboard as I prepared the next phase of the operation. "Derek is completely out of control. He knows he is going down, and he just drained Mom's retirement savings to fund his escape. We cannot leave you in there for another night." My father shook his head heavily, fighting a wave of drug-induced exhaustion. "The guards are stationed at the end of the hall. No one gets in or out without authorization from the chief of psychiatry or the senior administrator." I smiled, bringing up a separate window on my monitor. "Derek is suspended, but the Human Resources Department has not officially revoked his digital authorization tokens yet. The bureaucratic lag time is exactly what we need. I am going to forge a secure medical transfer order using Derek's own administrative account. I accessed the hospital's patient transfer portal. Using the credentials I scraped from the network directory, I logged in under Derek's official profile. I drafted an urgent, high-priority medical directive. I wrote that William required immediate transfer to a specialized neurological facility across the state line for an emergency assessment. I designated a private third-party medical transport service to handle the extraction, deliberately bypassing the hospital's internal ambulance fleet. I selected a private transport company owned by a former client of mine, someone I trusted implicitly to ask no questions. I authorized the digital order, stamping it with Derek's credentials, and overriding the secondary physician approval by classifying it as an extreme liability emergency. The order went through the system flawlessly. The hospital dispatcher approved the transfer request within seconds. The transport team will be there in 20 minutes, I told my father. They will have a wheelchair and matching transfer order. Do exactly what they say. They are taking you to a secure safe house outside the city limits. I will be there. My father nodded, sitting up straighter, the adrenaline clearly fighting back the sedatives. I will be ready, Autumn. I terminated the connection, severing the digital link to the hospital before their network security could detect the anomaly. I slumped back in my chair, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. The extraction was officially in motion. As I gathered my things to leave for the safe house, the extraction was officially in motion. As I gathered my things to leave for the safe house, my secure laptop chimed with an incoming email. It was an automated digital invitation sent to my public business email address. The subject line was draped in elegant gold-colored font. It was a formal invitation from Vanessa's real estate firm, inviting the elite members of the Seattle business community to an exclusive appreciation gala this weekend. I opened the message, reading the flowery language about celebrating family values and corporate integrity. My sister was hosting a massive, high-profile charity and investment dinner at one of the most expensive ballrooms in the city. It made absolutely no sense. She and Derek were bankrupt, facing a federal audit and currently running on the stolen funds from our mother's retirement account. Then the realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The gala was not a celebration. It was a desperate, elaborate cover. Vanessa was using the high society event to solicit massive, untraceable cash investments from Seattle's wealthy elite under the guise of a new real estate venture. It was a spectacular, brazen money laundering scheme designed to wash their stolen funds and secure their escape. 27 minutes later, the transport supervisor sent the coded confirmation we had arranged passengers secure. The private team had entered with the approved transfer order, moved William through the loading bay, and left before anyone questioned the suspended administrator's credentials. I met them at a licensed recovery residence outside Seattle, where an independent physician examined my father, documented the sedatives in his system, and confirmed that he was mentally competent. William signed a sworn statement describing the confinement, the forged psychiatric diagnosis, and the threats he overheard. We sent that statement, the physician's report, the USB evidence, and the recorded threat from Derek to my attorney. By midnight, the package had reached the FBI agents already assigned to the hospital grant investigation. They did not promise an arrest on my timetable, but the lead agent agreed that the gala created an extraordinary opportunity. Vanessa and Derek would be together, surrounded by witnesses, actively soliciting money through the same company connected to the fraudulent transfers. William insisted on appearing only after the agents secured the exits. I argued that he needed rest. He answered by asking whether I expected him to hide while his daughter finished a war he had helped start. The next afternoon, federal agents reviewed the ballroom plan with my security team. When my car finally turned toward the Grandview Hotel, my father was safe. The evidence was in official hands, and the people inside that gala had no idea the room was already closing around them. My private car pulled up to the grand entrance of the Grandview Hotel, the most exclusive ballroom in downtown Seattle. Vanessa had spared absolutely no expense for her so-called appreciation gala. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. I stepped out of the car, smoothing the fabric of my emerald green evening gown. It was an elegant custom piece I had purchased years ago, radiating absolute authority. I did not look like the struggling outcast my family painted me to be.
I looked like a woman who owned the room. I walked through the double doors. Towering floral arrangements of white orchids decorated every table. A string quartet played softly, providing a backdrop to the clinking champagne glasses of wealthy investors. Vanessa was playing her role to perfection. I spotted her near the center of the room, wearing a glittering gold dress, laughing brightly as she charmed a group of older businessmen. Derek stood right beside her, holding a crystal glass projecting the image of a successful, untroubled hospital executive. They looked like the perfect Seattle power couple, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire empire was built on stolen funds and a ticking clock. I accepted a glass of champagne and positioned myself near the center aisle, surveying the elaborate trap they had set for themselves. This was the pinnacle of their artificial world, built entirely on deceit and stolen resources, and I was about to bring the entire structure crashing down around them. They had constructed a glamorous house of cards funding the champagne and caviar with the very money they stole from our aging mother. Now it was time to collect. It did not take long. Vanessa turned to signal a waiter and froze. Her bright, artificial smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She tapped Derek on the arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Derek followed her gaze, and the color rapidly drained from his face. They looked like two terrified criminals caught in the headlights. Then, the mask of arrogance slammed back into place. Derek forced a polite smile to his guests before he and Vanessa broke away and marched directly toward me. Their footsteps were fast and aggressive, their body language screaming suppressed rage. They stopped inches from my face, vibrating with anger. "What do you think you are doing here?" Vanessa hissed, keeping her voice low so the nearby investors would not overhear. "This is an exclusive, invite-only corporate event. You are not on the guest list. You need to leave right now before you embarrass yourself." I took a deliberate sip of champagne, meeting her glare with unbreakable calm. "I received a digital invitation in my inbox," I replied smoothly. "It said you were celebrating family values and corporate integrity. I figured I should come see how you managed to celebrate integrity while running on our mother's stolen retirement savings." Derek stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched in his cheek. "You think you are so clever, Autumn," he muttered, his tone dripping with venom. "You think you can just show up and ruin the most important night of our lives because you are bitter? We are in the middle of securing multi-million-dollar investments. We are not going to let a jealous, failing accountant cause a scene and scare off our financial partners." I smiled warmly, looking past him to the wealthy guests mingling in the room. "They are not investing in a real estate venture, Derek. They are throwing their money into a desperate money laundering scheme because you need to replace $4 million before the federal auditors arrive at your hospital." Derek flinched as if I had struck him physically. His eyes darted around the room in absolute panic. "Shut your mouth," he demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. He raised his hand and sharply snapped his fingers toward the entrance. Two large, imposing security guards immediately broke away from their posts and hurried over to our location. "We have a serious problem here," Derek told the guards, projecting his voice just enough to sound authoritative but not alarmed. "This woman is a disturbed individual who has been stalking my wife. She slipped past the front desk and she is harassing our corporate guests. I need you to escort her off the premises immediately. Use force if she resists. Do not let her cause a public disturbance." The guards nodded, their expressions stern as they stepped toward me. One of them reached out, preparing to grab my arm and physically drag me toward the exit. Vanessa crossed her arms over her chest, a smug, triumphant smirk spreading across her painted lips. "You really thought you could come here and play games with us?" she whispered maliciously. "You have always been nothing but a pathetic nuisance, Autumn. Now you get to be thrown out onto the street like the trash you are. Have a nice walk home." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I calmly reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, folded piece of premium parchment paper. I held it up, stopping the security guard dead in his tracks. "Actually, gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft music of the string quartet, "you cannot remove me from this building. I am not a trespasser, and I am certainly not a stalker. I am the primary financial sponsor of tonight's event." I handed the document directly to the head security guard. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the official legal seals and the corporate letterhead. Vanessa frowned, her smug expression faltering. "What is she talking about?" Derek asked, looking from me to the guard. I turned my attention back to my sister, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally break across my face. "I told you I received an invitation, Vanessa. But it was not sent to my personal email. It was sent to the corporate address of the Wyoming-based blind trust that just purchased your real estate holdings." I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly and hollow under the brilliant chandelier lights. "That is right," I continued, my voice steady and completely merciless. "You sold your properties and your stolen shares to an anonymous holding company on Thursday to get untraceable cash. You never bothered to check who owned that holding company. It is mine. I am the sole chairman of the trust, which means I am now the majority shareholder owning 60% of your entire real estate firm. You work for me now." Vanessa staggered backward, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Derek looked like he was going to vomit, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that their entire escape plan had just been brutally dismantled. I had trapped their funds, seized their company, and cornered them in a room full of the very investors they were trying to defraud. But before Vanessa could even attempt to formulate a pathetic defense, the soft, elegant classical music from the string quartet abruptly cut out. A sharp, piercing burst of static shrieked through the central speaker system, freezing every single guest in the ballroom. The sudden, heavy silence that followed was entirely suffocating, filled with dark, inevitable anticipation. The long-awaited moment of absolute truth had finally arrived for all of them. The harsh static slicing through the grand ballroom lasted only a few terrifying seconds, but it was enough to command the absolute attention of every single guest in the room. The wealthy investors, local politicians, and socialites stopped mid-sentence, lowering their crystal champagne flutes and turning their eyes toward the massive speakers mounted high above the stage. Vanessa gasped, hands flying to her throat as she realized the expensive audio-visual system was no longer under her control. I stood completely still, watching the panic set into her features. I had bypassed the hotel network security hours ago, routing my secure mobile workstation directly into their main broadcasting feed. The static abruptly died, replaced by a crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording that echoed off the gilded ceilings. It was the sound of a phone ringing, followed by the sharp click of someone answering. Then my sister's voice filled the cavernous space. It was not the sweet, charming tone she had been using all night to solicit investments. It was cold, arrogant, and dripping with malicious triumph. The recording captured her exact words from that fateful 7 o'clock morning call. "Dad died last night," her voice announced, magnified 100 times over. "His heart gave out, no funeral, there is no money for it. He signed a new will before he passed. He left the logistics company and every cent to Derek and me. You get absolutely nothing, Autumn. Do not even bother showing your face." A collective gasp rippled through the elegant crowd. Men and women in tailored suits and expensive gowns exchanged horrified glances. But the recording was not finished. Derek's voice boomed through the speakers next, laughing with a cruel, dark amusement. "Finally, you are out of the picture,"
he sneered through the audio feed. "We have the legal documents and we are selling it all. You are homeless, and your crazy father is rotting exactly where he belongs. Go cry somewhere else." The audio file clipped looping back to the beginning and playing the devastating admission of their greed a second time. The pristine image Vanessa and Derek had spent the evening carefully constructing shattered entirely. The wealthy guests were now staring at her with profound disgust and alarm. Derek's face turned a violent purple. His career, his freedom, and his last desperate chance at washing his stolen money were evaporating before his eyes. "Shut it off!" he screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged forward. "Turn the damn speakers off right now!" He shoved past startled investors, knocking a tray out of a waiter's hands. He sprinted frantically toward the main stage, aiming for the audiovisual control booth, located behind the heavy velvet curtains. He intended to physically rip the wiring out of the wall. He did not make it past the first step. Two towering men in black suits stepped out from the shadows, moving with the precision of trained military personnel. They were part of a private elite security firm I had hired earlier that very afternoon, using funds from my blind trust. They stepped directly into Derek's path, forming an impenetrable human wall. Derek slammed into them wildly, trying to throw a punch, but the guards did not even flinch. One of them smoothly caught Derek by the shoulders, twisted his arms behind his back, and forced him down to his knees on the polished hardwood floor. Derek struggled pathetically, shouting threats and demanding someone call the police, completely unaware that he was only digging his own grave deeper. While Derek thrashed on the ground, the massive LED screens positioned behind the main podium suddenly flared to life. Vanessa screamed as the screens, which were supposed to display her fake real estate portfolio, shifted to reveal something entirely different. I had queued up a meticulously organized visual presentation of Derek's federal crimes. A giant spreadsheet filled the central screen, highlighting the exact $4 million missing from his private hospital's procurement fund. High-resolution scans of his forged invoices were projected for everyone to see. Right next to the invoices, the screen displayed the offshore bank account routing numbers in the Cayman Islands, proving, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the money had gone directly into Derek's private shell company. The ballroom erupted into sheer chaos. Investors began pulling out their cell phones, taking pictures of the undeniable evidence projected on the wall. A prominent local banker, who had been chatting with Vanessa just 10 minutes earlier, demanded his preliminary investment check back immediately. People were shouting, moving away from my sister, as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Vanessa stood frozen in the center of the room, trembling uncontrollably in her glittering gold dress. Her perfect manicured life was burning to the ground in front of the city's elite. She looked wildly around the room, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. When her eyes finally locked onto mine, the raw, unfiltered hatred in her gaze was matched only by her absolute terror. "Autumn, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper over the rising roar of the angry crowd. She took a step toward me, her hands reaching out in a desperate, pathetic gesture. "Please stop this. You are ruining everything. We are your family. You cannot destroy us like this. I will give you the house back. I will give you whatever you want, just turning the screens off before the police get here." I did not move an inch. I looked at the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. "You destroyed yourselves, Vanessa," I said, my voice cutting through the noise with chilling clarity. "You tried to throw our father into a psychiatric ward. You tried to render me homeless. You thought you could steal his life's work to cover up a federal crime, and you expected me to just sit back and take it? You chose money over blood, and now you have to pay the exact price of that choice. The transaction is final, and the evidence has already been forwarded to the federal authorities." Derek was still struggling against the security guards, his face pressed against the floor, screaming that the documents on the screen were fabricated.
He yelled that I was a bitter, jealous sibling trying to frame him, begging the investors not to believe the digital presentation. But the crowd was not listening to his desperate lies. They were watching the screens cycle through undeniable proof of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forged medical directives. The Grand Appreciation Gala had transformed into a public execution of their character and freedom. The shouting in the ballroom reached a fever pitch as guests demanded answers and attempted to locate the exit. But before the chaos could spiral completely out of control, a sudden, booming sound echoed from the back of the hall. The massive, solid oak double doors at the main entrance were thrown violently open, slamming against the interior walls with a force that rattled the crystal chandeliers. The impact instantly silenced the angry crowd. Every single person in the room turned their head toward the back of the ballroom. A tall, imposing silhouette stepped through the doorway, stepping out of the shadows and into the bright light of the entryway. Vanessa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as all the color drained from her face. Derek stopped struggling against the guards, his eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror. The man standing in the doorway was not a frail, incapacitated patient. My father, William, stood tall and immaculate in a sharply tailored charcoal power suit. His posture was rigid with authority, and his sharp eyes swept across the frozen ballroom with the commanding presence of a chief executive who had just reclaimed his throne. There was no trace of the sedatives Derek had forced into his system yesterday. He looked powerful, furious, and completely unstoppable. Right behind him, moving with coordinated precision, stepped 4 federal agents. They wore dark windbreakers with the unmistakable yellow lettering of the FBI across their backs. The agents immediately fanned out, taking strategic positions to block the main exit and secure the perimeter. The wealthy investors and socialites in the room collectively held their breath, completely paralyzed by the unfolding spectacle. My father began to walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The crowd of elite guests instinctively parted for him, creating a wide, clear path. The only sound in the cavernous space was the steady striking of his leather shoes against the polished hardwood floor. He kept his blazing gaze locked entirely on Vanessa and Derek. I watched my sister physically shrink backward, her trembling knees buckling slightly under her terror. "Dad," Vanessa stammered, her voice shaking so violently it was barely a whisper. "Dad, you are alive. We were so worried. We thought you wandered away from the hospital. We were just trying to protect your assets until you were found safe." My father stopped a few feet away from her. He looked at his youngest daughter, the golden child he had indulged and protected for nearly 3 decades, and his expression held no warmth. "Save your breath, Vanessa," my father said, his voice echoing loudly in the room. "Your performance is over. I heard every single word you and your husband said in that hospital hallway. I laid in that bed while you planned to sedate me into a permanent coma so you could liquidate my life's work and cover up a federal crime. You did not want to protect my assets. You wanted to steal them, to save yourselves." He turned slightly, raising his voice to address the hundreds of shocked investors standing in the room. He pointed a steady finger toward Derek, who was still kneeling on the floor under the watchful eyes of my private security guards. "This man," my father announced, "clearly used his administrative privileges at a private medical center to forge a psychiatric evaluation. He attempted to hold me against my will, pumping me full of dangerous narcotics to render me legally incompetent. He did this because he embezzled $4 million from federal hospital grants, and he needed my logistics company to wash his stolen money." A fresh wave of horrified murmurs spread through the crowd. Several prominent business leaders shook their heads in absolute disgust. My father turned his attention back to Vanessa, who was now weeping openly, her tears ruining her expensive makeup. "And you, my father," continued his tone dropping to a cold, unforgiving register, "you eagerly assisted him. You forged my signature on a new will. You illegally attempted to sell your sister's home out from under her. You lied to the police and you stole your own mother's retirement savings to fund this pathetic, desperate gala. You have disgraced this family and you have committed federal fraud." Vanessa sobbed loudly, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. "Daddy, please," she begged. "Derek made me do it. I was scared. I did not know how to fix the debt. You have to forgive me. I am your daughter." "You lost the right to call yourself my daughter the moment you decided my life was worth less than your husband's offshore bank account," my father replied, without a single ounce of hesitation. "Let me make my intentions perfectly clear right here, in front of all these witnesses. I have already spoken with my legal team. I am officially stripping you of any inheritance. You are permanently removed from my will, my trusts, and my life. You will not receive a single cent of the wealth I have built." My father then turned away from the sobbing mess of my sister and looked directly at me. His fierce expression softened into one of profound pride and deep respect. He stepped closer and placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. Furthermore, my father announced I am formally naming Autumn as my successor and appointing her Chief Strategy Officer with full executive authority over the logistics company. My board chair and corporate counsel completed the emergency succession resolution this afternoon. I will remain the controlling owner while I recover, but every major operational decision will now run through her office. She is the reason the company still belongs to this family, and she is the only person I trust to lead it into the future. The declaration was not an impulsive promise made for dramatic effect. Two directors near the front of the ballroom nodded, confirming that the board had approved the resolution. Corporate counsel held the signed documents in a sealed folder. For my entire life, I had been treated as an unwanted burden whose intelligence made other people uncomfortable. Now my father was recognizing my ability before the city's most powerful business leaders, not with a decorative title, but with the authority to prove what I could build. While my father spoke, I noticed Derek's eyes darting frantically around the room. The private security guards had loosened their grip slightly, distracted by my father's booming announcement. Derek saw the federal agents moving slowly down the side aisles, closing the net around the stage. He knew his career was destroyed, his marriage was over, and a lengthy federal prison sentence was waiting for him. Panic completely overrode his rational thought process. Derek violently twisted his shoulders, breaking free from the momentary lapse in the security guard's grip. He scrambled to his feet, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. He did not run toward the main entrance, knowing the FBI agents were blocking the path. Instead, he spun around and sprinted frantically toward the heavy velvet curtains behind the presentation stage, aiming for the narrow service exit used by the catering staff. Derek stopped, Vanessa screamed, her voice cracking in pure panic as she watched her husband abandon her. Derek ignored her completely. He pushed past a terrified waiter, knocking a tray of glasses to the ground in a spray of shattered crystal. He lunged toward the metal crash bar of the service door, his hand outstretched, desperately reaching for the briefest chance of freedom. He was mere inches away from the exit. He never even touched the door. A federal agent who had anticipated the exact escape route stepped smoothly out from the shadows of the catering corridor. Before Derek could even register the movement, the agent lunged forward. He drove his shoulder hard into Derek's midsection, executing a flawless, powerful tackle. The heavy impact lifted Derek entirely off his feet. They crashed heavily down onto the polished hardwood floor with a violent, bone-rattling thud, knocking the breath completely out of Derek's burning lungs. The sound of the impact echoed through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Derek writhed on the floor, gasping for air, his suit jacket bunched up around his shoulders. The federal agent did not hesitate. He swiftly pinned Derek down, driving a knee firmly between his shoulder blades to keep him immobilized. A second agent materialized from the corridor, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto Derek's wrists with a sharp, metallic click. The brutal efficiency of the takedown left the remaining guests absolutely paralyzed.
The wealthy investors pressed themselves flat against the walls, desperate to distance themselves from the criminal scene. My father stood at the end of the center aisle, watching his son-in-law squirm on the hardwood floor. He showed absolutely no pity at all. He just adjusted his cuffs, his face an impenetrable mask of quiet authority. Vanessa remained frozen on the stage, her hands still covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide, taking in the sight of her husband being hauled roughly to his feet by the federal agents. Derek looked directly at Vanessa, expecting her to scream, to call a lawyer, or use her charm to fix the situation. But Vanessa had absolutely nothing left to offer. The glamorous illusion she had built her entire life upon had been completely pulverized. The reality of her choices was finally wrapping its hands around her throat. The sheer weight of her impending destruction caused Vanessa's knees to buckle. She collapsed onto the floor of the stage, her glittering gold dress pooling awkwardly around her legs. Her carefully styled hair fell into her face, sticking to the tears streaming continuously down her cheeks. She looked at the federal agents securing the room, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked sobs. Realizing Derek was a lost cause, her eyes locked onto me. She scrambled off the low stage, crawling awkwardly on her hands and knees across the polished floor, until she reached the space right in front of where I stood. "Autumn," she wailed, her voice breaking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Autumn, you have to stop them. Please tell them it was all a misunderstanding. I am your sister. We share the same blood. You cannot just stand there and let them take me away." I looked down at the woman who spent 30 years making sure I felt beneath her. Her face was streaked with mascara, her voice stripped of its usual condescending arrogance. She reached out her trembling fingers, grabbing the fabric of my emerald green dress, trying to force a connection that never existed. "Please," she begged, her voice echoing in the quiet ballroom. "I was just following Derek's lead. He told me the hospital was going to ruin us. I did not want to hurt Dad. I did not want to take your home. I was just terrified. You are my family, Autumn. You have to protect me." I stared down at her, gripping my dress. I simply observed her, analyzing the desperate mechanics of a narcissist who had finally run out of victims to sacrifice. "You were not terrified, Vanessa," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You were greedy. You saw an opportunity to enrich yourself by burying the two people who were supposed to be your family, and you took it without hesitation." A frantic commotion suddenly rippled near the front entrance. My mother, Susan, pushed her way through the line of federal agents, having just arrived at the gala after realizing her bank accounts were completely drained. She saw Derek in handcuffs, my father and Vanessa sobbing at my feet. Susan rushed forward, stumbling in her heels, and threw herself down on the floor, right next to Vanessa. She wrapped her arms around her golden child, glaring up at me with wild, desperate eyes. "Autumn, look at what you are doing!" my mother cried out, her voice dripping with the same manipulative guilt she used to control me my entire life. "Look at your sister. She is terrified. You have made your point. You have your money and your father's company. Now you need to tell these agents to leave. You have to drop the charges. Please, Autumn, remember sisterhood. Remember that you two are blood. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal prison." I let out a low, humorless laugh. The sheer audacity of her demand was staggering. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, stripping away decades of conditioned compliance. "Sisterhood," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue as if it were a foreign concept. "You want to talk about sisterhood now? Where was this sisterhood when you stole my college tuition to buy her a sports car? Where was the sisterhood when she threw me out of my own house?" I shifted my gaze back down to Vanessa, who was staring up at me with wide-eyed, fearful eyes. I leaned in slightly, making sure my words would be etched permanently into her memory.
"When you called me at 7 in the morning to announce that our father was dead," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "When you delivered that news with a smile on your face and laughed about leaving me with absolutely nothing, sisterhood died right along with your humanity. Do not ever invoke that word to me again." My mother recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. My father took a slow, deliberate step forward, casting a tall shadow over both of them. He looked at his former wife, and the daughter he had once cherished, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. "You chose your path, Susan," my father said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge. "You enabled her greed. You nurtured her cruelty. And you watched her try to end my life without shedding a single tear. You too deserve exactly what is coming to you." A female federal agent stepped forward from the perimeter, breaking the tense standoff. She walked briskly past my father and stopped beside where Vanessa was kneeling. She simply looked down at her with absolute professional detachment. "Vanessa," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the fraudulent transfer of real estate property across federal jurisdictions." Vanessa let out a piercing shriek. She scrambled backward, trying to hide behind my mother's trembling frame, but there was nowhere left to run. The female agent reached down, grabbed Vanessa by the arm, and hauled her roughly to her feet. My mother screamed, clawing desperately at the agent's jacket, but another officer quickly pulled Susan back and restrained her against the wall. "Please," Vanessa sobbed. "I did not do it alone. Derek made me sign the papers. You have to believe me. I am a victim here." The agent completely ignored her frantic pleas. She swiftly twisted Vanessa's arms behind her back. The heavy metallic sound of the handcuffs clicking securely onto my sister's wrists echoed loudly through the silent ballroom, sealing her fate once and for all. The female agent stepped back, keeping a firm grip on Vanessa's arm as she struggled against the heavy steel handcuffs. The polished veneer my sister had cultivated evaporated into a pathetic display of panic. She kicked her feet, her expensive heels scraping uselessly against the floor as the agent forced her forward. Across the room, two other agents hauled Derek to his feet. His suit was rumpled, his tie askew, and his face was drained of the arrogant pride he had worn just an hour earlier. The agents marched them down the center aisle of the ballroom, moving toward the heavy oak doors at the main entrance. The crowd of elite Seattle investors shrank back in absolute revulsion, muttering amongst themselves. The sea of wealthy guests parted widely, creating a corridor of silent condemnation. These were the exact same individuals who had just been praising my sister's fictitious brilliance. No one offered a single word of support or stepped forward to defend the disgraced couple. The room was filled with the quiet, devastating sounds of judgment. I heard disgusted whispers and the rustle of high society turning its back on two exposed frauds. Vanessa looked frantically from left to right as she was paraded past people she had tried to impress. She made eye contact with a prominent local developer she had charmed earlier. He turned his head away, refusing to acknowledge her existence. The sheer, suffocating humiliation of the moment was palpable. The golden child was now nothing more than a common criminal being marched out of her own gala in handcuffs. Derek kept his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He knew the federal auditors were already tearing through his hospital procurement files. He knew there was no lawyer who could save him from the digital evidence I had handed over to the authorities. He did not look at Vanessa or my father. He just stared at the polished floor, walking toward the inevitable consequences of his own boundless greed. My mother, Susan, remained pinned against the wall by the perimeter security. She was shaking violently, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended mere shock. For over 3 decades, Susan had built her entire identity around Vanessa's perceived perfection. She had sacrificed my college education, my emotional well-being, and my place in the family to ensure that her favorite daughter had every advantage. She had blindly excused every cruel comment, justified every selfish action, and defended every manipulation because Vanessa was supposed to be her ultimate achievement. Now staring at the flashing lights reflecting through the ballroom windows, the massive, impenetrable delusion my mother had constructed finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The brutal reality of the situation crashed down upon her shoulders. Her perfect, flawless daughter was not a victim of circumstance. She was a calculated, manipulative felon who had willingly attempted to destroy her own family for financial gain. Even worse, Susan was forced to confront the horrifying fact that she was the one who had created this monster. By constantly shielding Vanessa from accountability, Susan had practically handed her the blueprint for destruction. As Susan watched the federal agents escort Vanessa and Derek through the main doors, the financial reality of her own situation struck her with devastating force. Vanessa had completely drained her retirement savings that very morning. Every cent my mother had put away for her twilight years was currently locked in a frozen offshore shell account that the government would undoubtedly seize. Susan had no home to return to, no savings to draw from, and absolutely no means of supporting herself. Her golden child was heading to a federal penitentiary. She was completely, utterly, and terrifyingly alone. The golden pedestal she had so painstakingly built for her favorite child had instantly transformed into an inescapable trap, leaving her with no safety net and no avenue for redemption. Outside the hotel, the cool Seattle night air offered no comfort. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the grand entrance, casting long shadows across the pavement. A small crowd of onlookers and hotel staff had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the spectacle. Vanessa was guided toward the back of a dark SUV. Right before the agent pushed her down into the back seat, she turned her head and looked back into the brightly lit lobby. She was searching for a lifeline, a final glimmer of hope that someone, anyone, was coming to save her. There was no one. The heavy vehicle door slammed shut, cutting off her view and sealing her inside. Derek was loaded into a separate car, his expression entirely vacant. The federal convoy pulled away from the curb, merging into the downtown traffic and disappearing into the darkness of the city. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere remained incredibly tense and unnerving. My father and I stood near the entrance, watching the vehicles depart. We had won the battle, secured the logistics empire, and permanently neutralized the threat. Yet there was no triumphant celebration between us. We simply shared a quiet look of mutual understanding. We had done what was necessary to survive a betrayal that never should have happened in the first place. Slowly, the heavy footsteps of my mother echoed across the marble floor. Susan approached us, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. The impeccable styling she had arrived with was completely ruined. She looked like a hollow, terrified shell of the commanding matriarch she had once pretended to be. She stopped a few feet away from my father, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths, as she stared at him in total silence. Her eyes were swimming with desperate, pleading tears. She slowly reached out her trembling hand, extending toward his tailored suit sleeve. She was looking for a savior, hoping that the decades of history between them might somehow spark a lingering sense of duty or affection. "William," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her absolute despair. "William, please. I have absolutely nothing left. They took everything from me. I do not have a place to sleep tonight. I do not have a single dollar to my name. Please, you have to help me. We were married for 20 years. We built a family together. You cannot just leave me out here on the street like this. Please, just give me another chance. Let me come home with you." Susan's fingers brushed against the fabric of his suit jacket. She tried to grab his hand, her grip desperate and clinging, searching for the familiar warmth of the man who had always tried to keep the peace. My father did not hesitate. His expression remained incredibly calm, devoid of any anger or lingering resentment. He simply looked down at the woman who had enabled the attempted destruction of his life. With a smooth, deliberate motion, William firmly pulled his arm back, easily breaking her weak, desperate grip and leaving her hand grasping at empty air. He adjusted his cufflink, completely unbothered by her devastating sorrow, and stared down at her with a chilling, absolute finality that confirmed she had permanently forfeited any right to his protection. The heavy oak doors of the Grandview Hotel closed behind us, shutting out the chaotic aftermath of the gala. My father adjusted his suit jacket, his face a portrait of quiet resolve. We walked out into the cool Seattle night air together, leaving my mother standing alone in the grand lobby, staring at her empty hands. She had made her choices, and now she had to live in the desolate reality she constructed. The drive back to my apartment was silent, but it was a comfortable, validating silence. The long, exhausting war of manipulation and deceit was finally over. Now the cold, methodical wheels of the federal justice system were going to take over. Over the next 6 months, the federal prosecutors worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against my sister and brother-in-law. My job was far from finished. I spent hundreds of hours in secure conference rooms with FBI financial analysts and assistant United States attorneys. I walked them through every single line of my forensic audit. I showed them exactly how Derek had established the shell companies in the Cayman Islands, how he routed the stolen hospital procurement funds through encrypted digital ledgers, and how Vanessa attempted to wash that stolen money using my father's corporate shares and my personal real estate property. The evidence was absolute. I left them no margin for error, no plausible deniability, and absolutely no legal loopholes to crawl through. As the trial date rapidly approached, the pressure of the impending federal charges began to crush Derek and Vanessa. Initially, they tried to present a united, defiant front. They hired expensive defense attorneys, using the last of their liquidated credit, arrogantly believing they could charm or manipulate their way out of a federal indictment. But federal prosecutors do not care about country club reputations or tearful dramatic performances. They care about paper trails, wire fraud statutes, and digital footprints. When the prosecution presented the mountain of undeniable digital evidence during the discovery phase, the illusion of their perfect marriage instantly evaporated. Survival instincts kicked in, and the two golden socialites quickly turned into cornered, desperate animals. By the time the trial officially commenced at the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle, Derek and Vanessa were not even speaking to each other. They sat at entirely separate defense tables, refusing to make eye contact. The courtroom was packed with local journalists, former hospital board members, and curious investors who had been present at the disastrous gala. I sat in the front row of the gallery, right next to my father. We watched the proceedings with calm, detached observation. The defining moment of the trial arrived on the third day of testimonies. Recognizing that he was facing decades in federal prison for embezzlement and corporate fraud, Derek made a highly calculated, utterly ruthless decision. He instructed his defense attorney to throw his wife entirely under the bus. When Derek took the stand to testify in his own defense, he completely abandoned Vanessa. Under oath, he spun a pathetic, desperate narrative claiming that he was just an overworked, highly stressed hospital administrator trying to balance complex medical budgets. He looked directly at the jury and testified that Vanessa was the true mastermind behind the entire criminal enterprise. He claimed she manipulated his hospital credentials to forge the psychiatric hold on my father. He swore that Vanessa forged the will entirely on her own because of her insatiable greed and her lifelong bitter jealousy toward me. He painted himself as a naive, trusting husband who had been blinded by love, insisting he had absolutely no idea his wife was committing wire fraud and attempting to steal her own family's wealth. The moment those cowardly, self-serving words left Derek's mouth, the courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Vanessa shot up from her chair at the defense table, her face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She screamed at her husband across the courtroom, calling him a liar, a coward, and a pathetic thief. She completely lost whatever shred of polished composure she had left, yelling that the embezzlement was his idea and that he had forced her to sell the properties to save him from the federal audit. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, threatening to hold her in contempt and ordering the bailiffs to physically restrain her. It was a spectacular, humiliating implosion. They were viciously tearing each other apart, right in front of the judge, completely destroying whatever remaining credibility their defense teams had managed to scrape together. My father simply shook his head, watching his youngest daughter reveal her true vicious nature to the public. But their mutual destruction and theatrical courtroom drama did not actually matter. The federal prosecutor simply allowed them to finish their screaming match before systematically dismantling both of their fabricated defenses. The prosecutor called me to the stand as the primary expert witness. I calmly walked the jury through the digital timeline of the fraud. I demonstrated how Derek's administrative login was used to execute the offshore wire transfers months before the forged will even existed. I showed them the electronic signature Vanessa used to eagerly authorize the fraudulent property sale across state lines. I projected the metadata from the fake psychiatric evaluation, proving it was created on Derek's personal laptop inside their home. The digital audit trail I had mapped out was sharp, precise, and completely irrefutable. There was no way to blame a single mastermind when the financial records clearly proved they had actively and enthusiastically conspired together to commit massive federal fraud. The defense attorneys tried to cross-examine me, attempting to twist my actions into some sort of vengeful family vendetta. I remained completely calm and professional, answering their aggressive questions with cold, indisputable mathematical facts. Numbers do not hold grudges, and data does not lie. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, the jury's expressions were set in stone. They looked at Vanessa and Derek with absolute, unmistakable disgust. The trial concluded with a stunning swiftness that left the defense completely paralyzed. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before informing the bailiff they had reached a unanimous decision. The courtroom fell completely silent as the jury foreperson stood up to read the official document. The heavy, suffocating weight of reality finally crashed down on the defendants, stripping away the last remnants of their arrogance. They were found guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and the fraudulent transfer of real estate property across multiple strict federal banking jurisdictions. The judge looked down from the high wooden bench, his expression stern and profoundly unforgiving as he addressed the deeply disgraced couple standing before him in the silent room. He admonished them for their breathtaking greed, their blatant abuse of medical authority, and their appalling, heartless willingness to completely destroy an elderly family member purely for selfish financial gain. The final sentencing hearing was immediately scheduled, and the harsh, devastating reality of their situation was entirely undeniable. Derek and Vanessa were now facing mandatory, incredibly long-term federal prison sentences, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Following the judge's final gavel strike, the reality of their sentences set in. Derek and Vanessa were transferred to federal holding facilities to await their permanent placements, completely stripped of their designer clothes and their curated social media lives. I walked out of the federal courthouse that sunny afternoon feeling a profound, undeniable sense of permanent closure. But there was still one major loose end tying me to the painful past: the grand house.
Through the mechanics of the blind trust I had established, I was now the absolute legal owner of the property Vanessa had so eagerly tried to steal. But when I drove past the manicured lawn and the familiar front porch a week later, I felt no desire to move my belongings back inside. The walls of that home were permanently stained with the memory of my mother's screaming accusations and my sister's calculated treachery. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was simply a dark physical manifestation of a family dynamic I had successfully destroyed. I contacted a reputable real estate agent the very next morning. I instructed her to list the property on the open market. Because of its highly desirable location and completely pristine condition, the magnificent house instantly sparked an aggressive bidding war and sold within 2 fast weeks for significantly over the original asking price. When the escrow cleared and the funds hit my secure accounts, I did not absorb the money into my personal wealth. I wanted to transform the darkest chapter of my life into something that would actively combat the kind of greed my sister represented. I sat down with my legal team and drafted the charter for a new educational foundation. I used the entire profit from the sale of the house to establish a fully funded scholarship program at my alma mater specifically dedicated to underprivileged female students pursuing degrees in forensic accounting and financial ethics. I wanted to ensure that other young women who had to fight for every scrap of their education, just like I had, would have the resources to build their own independent futures without relying on toxic family structures. It was the ultimate poetic purification of the stolen funds. As the seasons changed and the scholarship program welcomed its first cohort of brilliant young women, my daily routine settled into a comfortable, productive rhythm. I assumed the dust had completely settled. But narcissism rarely accepts defeat gracefully, even from behind concrete walls. About 4 months into Vanessa's federal sentence, the letters began to arrive at my office. They were stamped with the official seal of the Federal Correctional Institution. I stared at the first envelope for a long time before carefully slicing it open with a letter opener. The handwriting was frantic and jagged, completely devoid of the elegant, looping script Vanessa used to sign her high society invitations. The contents were entirely predictable. She spent the first page detailing the horrific, humiliating conditions of federal prison, complaining about the food, the scratchy uniforms, and the lack of basic respect from the guards. Then came the pivot. She shifted into desperate, manipulative pleading. She begged me to remember our childhood fabricating memories of sisterly bonding that never actually existed. She claimed Derek had forced her into everything, that she was just a naive wife who had made a terrible mistake. She asked me to deposit money into her prison commissary account and begged me to hire a high-powered appellate lawyer to help reduce her mandatory sentence. She ended the letter by insisting that our mother was suffering and that I had a moral obligation to fix the family I had broken. I read the entire letter without feeling a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger either. I simply felt an overwhelming, hollow indifference. Over the next few weeks, 5 more letters arrived, each one growing more desperate and erratic as my silence stretched on. I threw the second, third, fourth, and fifth letters directly into the paper shredder without even breaking the seals. But the constant arrival of the envelopes made me realize something important. Ignoring her was not enough. My silence was leaving a void that her delusional mind was filling with the false hope of eventual forgiveness. If I wanted absolute peace, I needed to look her in the eye one last time and permanently extinguish that hope. I contacted the federal prison facility and arranged for an approved visitor appointment. The drive to the correctional center took 2 hours, taking me far outside the glittering skyline of Seattle and into a desolate gray landscape
of wire fences and concrete barriers. The security processing was rigid and dehumanizing, a stark contrast to the luxurious world Vanessa used to command. I was escorted into a sterile, brightly lit visitation room, divided by thick, smudged plexiglass. I sat down in the hard plastic chair and waited. A few minutes later, a heavy metal door clanged open on the other side of the glass. A guard escorted Vanessa into the booth. I barely recognized the woman sitting down across from me. Her golden, perfectly highlighted hair had grown out into dull, matted roots. Her skin was pale and drawn, stripped of her expensive skincare routines and designer makeup. She wore an oversized, faded khaki uniform that swallowed her thin frame. When she looked up and saw me sitting there in a tailored emerald green business suit, a flash of her old, bitter jealousy twisted her features. But it quickly dissolved into desperate relief. She picked up the heavy black telephone receiver mounted to the wall. I slowly picked up my receiver, meeting her gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. "Autumn, you came!" she cried, her voice cracking through the cheap audio feed. "I knew you would! I knew you would not just abandon your own flesh and blood in a place like this. You read my letters. You know I am so sorry. You have to get me out of here. I cannot survive in this place." I listened to her frantic, pathetic rambling for a full minute before I finally spoke. "I did not come here to help you, Vanessa," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing with finality. "I came here to tell you to stop writing to my office. You are wasting your postage. I sold the house you tried to steal. I took every cent of the profit and used it to fund the education of women who actually work for a living. Your entire legacy has been erased and replaced by a scholarship fund for forensic accountants." Vanessa's mouth dropped open in absolute horrified shock. "But I am your sister," she sobbed, pressing her palm against the thick glass. "You won. You got everything. Have some mercy." I looked right into her desperate, terrified eyes, finally feeling absolutely nothing but pure, unyielding closure. "You announced our father's death with a bright, triumphant smile on your face," I replied, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper as I slowly stood up from my uncomfortable plastic chair. "The sister you are looking for died on that exact same morning. Do not ever contact me again." I stood up slowly from the hard, uncomfortable plastic chair without waiting to see the final reaction on her face. I turned my back to the thick plexiglass and walked straight toward the heavy metal exit doors. I could hear the muffled sound of her fists hitting the clear partition behind me, followed by the sharp, echoing commands of the correctional officers ordering her to step away, but I did not slow my pace. I walked down the long, sterile corridors of the federal facility, passed through multiple security checkpoints, and stepped out into the crisp air of the visitor parking lot. The oppressive atmosphere of the prison instantly lifted from my shoulders. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the desolate landscape of wire fences and concrete barriers. I did not look in my rearview mirror. For the first time in my life, I was no longer looking backward or anticipating the next betrayal. The drive back to Seattle felt fundamentally different than any journey I had ever taken. The lingering weight of family obligation, the persistent whisper of childhood guilt, and the toxic shadow of my mother and sister were gone. I had surgically excised the cancer from my life, leaving behind clean tissue ready to heal. When I finally arrived back in the bustling city, I did not go to my temporary apartment. Exactly 2 weeks prior, my father asked me to move into his estate on Mercer Island. At first, I had hesitated, fiercely protective of the independence I had spent years building from scratch. But William had not asked as a demanding patriarch. He asked as a father who wanted the chance to actually know the daughter he had been kept away from for 3 decades. I gladly accepted his invitation, And moving into his home became the first real step in rebuilding our shattered foundation. The estate was massive, but unlike the cold, performative houses my mother used to curate for her society friends, William's home was filled with genuine, lived-in warmth. We spent our evenings sitting on his expansive back patio overlooking Lake Washington, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and purple. It was during those long, quiet evenings that we finally unpacked the painful history my mother had so carefully orchestrated. William told me about the college trust funds he had tried to set up for me, the letters he had written, and the financial support he had attempted to provide during my early 20s. Susan had systematically intercepted every single effort, spinning a complex web of lies to convince him that I wanted nothing to do with his money, while simultaneously telling me that he refused to support my education. We talked for hours, dismantling the false narratives that had kept us isolated from each other. He apologized for not fighting harder to see through Susan's flawless deception, and I forgave him, understanding that we had both been victims of the exact same master manipulator. Healing was a slow process, but with every honest conversation, the invisible wounds I had carried for so long began to close. I was finally experiencing the unconditional paternal love I had always craved but never thought I would receive. As our personal relationship gradually strengthened, our professional dynamic evolved into a truly formidable partnership. True to his word at the disastrous gala, William formally stepped back from the daily operations of his logistics empire. He offered me the position of Chief Strategy Officer, giving me absolute authority over the company's future direction. I certainly did not step into the role lightly. I merged my background in forensic accounting and advanced cybersecurity directly into the infrastructure of his massive supply chain network. I spent my first 3 months auditing every operational department, streamlining international shipping routes, and implementing impenetrable digital security protocols that saved the corporation millions of dollars in potential operational liabilities. The board of directors, who had initially been skeptical of the founder's estranged daughter taking the helm, quickly realized I was not a nepotism hire. I was a calculating executive who demanded absolute excellence and delivered unprecedented financial results. Under my strategic direction, we acquired 2 major regional competitors, expanding the family empire across the Pacific Northwest and solidifying our dominance in the market. I was no longer just the brilliant accountant hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone to recognize my worth. I was the visible, undisputed leader of a highly lucrative corporate powerhouse. My days were filled with high-stakes negotiations, board meetings, and the profound realization that I was building an impenetrable legacy entirely on my own terms. The success I achieved was not a fragile facade designed to impress high society. It was tangible, hard-earned, and completely bulletproof. While my world expanded into a realm of unprecedented success and genuine peace, the reality for the woman who had orchestrated my lifetime of misery was drastically different. Susan had been completely evicted from the luxurious social circle she once ruled with an iron fist. With her retirement accounts permanently frozen by federal investigators and her golden child locked away in a federal penitentiary, she had absolutely no resources and no wealthy friends willing to associate with a disgraced enabler. Stripped of her designer clothes, her country club memberships, and her artificial pride, Susan was forced to face the brutal, unforgiving consequences of her own boundless greed. She ended up renting a tiny, dilapidated room in a run-down boarding house on the outskirts of Tacoma, far away from the glittering Seattle skyline she used to dominate. To simply afford basic groceries and keep the lights on, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life was reduced to taking grueling minimum-wage manual labor jobs. On a very damp, freezing Tuesday morning, Susan was working her shift at a sprawling, busy commercial transit station.
She wore a stained, oversized gray uniform, her hands cracked and calloused from harsh chemical cleaning supplies. She pushed a heavy, squeaking custodial cart across the scuffed tile floor, stopping to empty overflowing trash cans and wipe down sticky waiting area tables. Her shoulders were perpetually slumped, her face deeply lined with the permanent exhaustion of a life utterly destroyed by her own choices. She paused near a brightly lit newsstand kiosk to catch her breath, rubbing her aching lower back. Her dull, defeated eyes wandered absently over the colorful rows of publications displayed behind the glass. She stopped breathing. Her hands began to tremble so violently she had to grip the handle of her plastic cart to keep from collapsing. Staring back at her from the center rack was the latest issue of the most prestigious national business magazine in the country. The glossy cover featured a high-resolution, full-page photograph of a woman wearing an emerald green power suit, sitting confidently at the head of a massive mahogany boardroom table. The bold, golden headline printed across the bottom of the magazine read, "The Unstoppable Architect of a New Empire." Susan stared at the confident, powerful, and wildly successful face of the daughter she had spent 30 years trying to destroy. I never knew my mother stood in a freezing transit station that Tuesday morning, staring at my face on the cover of a magazine. I did not know, and I did not care. While Susan confronted the devastating consequences of her boundless greed, I was sitting at the exact mahogany boardroom table featured in that photograph, surrounded by people who genuinely valued my presence. The contrast between my new reality and the toxic environment I grew up in was staggering. For 30 years, my existence had been defined by a desperate struggle to earn a single scrap of approval from a family fundamentally incapable of providing it. I had been conditioned to believe love was a transactional currency, bestowed only upon the golden child. Now the suffocating atmosphere of my childhood was entirely gone, replaced by a profound sense of autonomy. As the chief strategy officer of my father's logistics empire, I was no longer the overlooked scapegoat hiding in the shadows. I was a respected executive, leading a massive corporate infrastructure. The most remarkable change was not the sudden wealth, it was the caliber of the people I chose to surround myself with. I built an executive team comprised of brilliant individuals who respected my analytical mind and trusted my strategic vision. We did not operate on manipulation or hidden agendas. We operated on mutual respect, transparent communication, and a shared dedication to excellence. For the first time in my career, I did not have to shrink myself to make someone else feel comfortable. I was allowed to be commanding and unapologetically ambitious. My colleagues did not view my intelligence as a threat to be neutralized. They saw it as an asset to be celebrated. This newfound environment of mutual respect slowly began to bleed into my personal life, altering how I interacted with the world around me. The trauma of my past had left me naturally guarded, cautious about letting new people past my emotional defenses. But as the months passed, I realized that keeping my walls entirely impenetrable was just another way of allowing my mother and sister to control my life. I had to learn how to open the door to let genuine connection in. I started attending networking events and joining philanthropic boards places where I met men and women who shared my passions and values. I formed deep, authentic friendships with people who did not care about my family drama or financial status. They cared about my sense of humor, my loyalty, and the way I showed up for them when things got difficult. One of my closest new friends was a corporate attorney named Claire, whom I met during a complex merger negotiation. Claire had also navigated the treacherous waters of a highly dysfunctional family, and we bonded over our shared understanding of what it meant to walk away from toxic bloodlines. Through Claire, I was introduced to a vibrant community of professionals who had all chosen to redefine the concept of family. We spent our weekends hosting casual dinner parties and showing up for each other's milestones.
When I was honored at a business banquet for my work with the Forensic Accounting Scholarship Fund, my entire row of tables was filled with these new friends. They cheered loudly, took terrible photographs on their phones, and celebrated my achievement with pure joy. They were just undeniably happy for me. It was through these nourishing relationships that my definition of the word family underwent a complete transformation. I had spent my entire life believing that family was an inescapable contract signed at birth that required endless sacrifice and infinite forgiveness. I thought being part of a family meant enduring whatever cruelty was handed to you simply because you shared the same DNA. But my new life taught me that family is not something you are born into. It is something you actively build. Family is comprised of the people who show up for you when the storm hits. It is the people who celebrate your victories without a single ounce of jealousy and who never use your vulnerabilities as ammunition. My relationship with my father, William, became the absolute cornerstone of this new, healthy definition of family. Living together on the Mercer Island estate allowed us to bridge the massive gap my mother had carefully maintained for decades. We developed a quiet, comfortable routine. We shared breakfast every morning, discussing global market trends over strong black coffee. In the evenings, we sat on the back deck, watching the boats glide across Lake Washington. He did not treat me like an employee, and he certainly did not treat me like a broken victim. He treated me like a trusted partner and a beloved daughter. He listened intently when I spoke about my day. For a man who had spent his life building an empire, his greatest joy now seemed to be the simple, uninterrupted presence of his oldest child. As the crisp days of autumn swept across Seattle, the holiday season rapidly approached. In the past, the weeks leading up to the holidays were a source of immense anxiety. Thanksgiving had always been a highly orchestrated, stressful performance directed by my mother, where every perceived slight was magnified and every conversation was a potential landmine. I used to spend those dinners staring at my plate, desperately counting the minutes until I could politely excuse myself and escape back to my apartment. But this year was completely different. This year, my father and I decided to host Thanksgiving at the estate, doing it entirely on our own terms. We did not invite any extended relatives who had silently stood by and enabled my mother's abuse for years. Instead, we invited our chosen family. The grand dining room was filled with the people who truly mattered. Claire and her partner were there, along with several of my closest colleagues and their families. My father invited a few of his oldest, most trusted friends from the logistics industry. The room was incredibly warm, echoing with genuine laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, and the rich smell of roasted turkey. There was absolutely no tension in the air, no hidden agendas, and no walking on eggshells. As we took our seats around the massive dining table, the lively conversations naturally began to quiet down. My father stood up at the head of the table, gently tapping his silver spoon against the rim of his crystal wineglass. He looked around the room, his eyes crinkling with deep, authentic happiness as he took in the faces of our chosen family. Finally, his gaze locked directly onto mine from across the long table. The room fell entirely silent, waiting for the patriarch to offer the traditional holiday blessing. But instead of a generic, practiced speech about gratitude and abundance, William placed his hands firmly on the edge of the table, his expression shifting into something profoundly vulnerable and intensely serious. He took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to deliver a heartfelt confession that would permanently alter how I viewed the long, painful journey that had brought us to this exact moment. He looked at every single one of us, letting the weight of the moment settle before speaking the absolute, unvarnished truth about our wonderful new life together. William remained standing at the head of the Thanksgiving table, both hands resting on the polished wood. For several seconds, he said nothing. The room was quiet enough for me to hear the soft crackle from the fireplace and the rain tapping against the tall windows overlooking Lake Washington. Then he looked directly at me.
I spent most of my life believing that keeping the peace made me a good father, he began. I told myself that silence protected this family. In reality, my silence protected the people causing the harm. Autumn paid the price for every argument I avoided, every lie I accepted, and every moment I chose comfort over truth. I cannot give her those years back. What I can do is spend the years I have left making sure she never doubts that I see her, respect her, and love her. My throat tightened, but I did not look away. Around the table, Claire, my colleagues, and my father's oldest friends listened without trying to fill the silence. William lifted his glass. "This is the first Thanksgiving in my home where nobody was invited out of obligation," he continued. "Every person here came because you have shown loyalty, courage, or kindness when it mattered. That is what family means to me now. Not blood used as a weapon, not forgiveness demanded without accountability. Family is the people who protect your dignity when you are vulnerable and celebrate your strength without trying to own it. To Autumn, who saved my life, saved my company, and taught me that peace without truth is only surrender." Everyone raised a glass. The applause that followed was warm rather than theatrical. I had spent years imagining that vindication would feel loud, like a courtroom verdict or a ballroom full of people watching Vanessa led away in handcuffs. Yet the moment that finally reached the deepest wound was quiet. It was my father telling the truth at a table where nobody needed me to become smaller. After dinner, we carried plates into the kitchen together. There were no servants moving silently through a performance of perfection. William dried dishes while Claire argued with one of my directors about the best way to reheat pie. Someone put on old music. People laughed when my father tried to dance with a dish towel over his shoulder. The house felt alive, in a way none of the expensive homes from my childhood ever had. Nothing in the room was based on fear. Later, I stepped onto the back terrace with a cup of coffee. The lake was dark, broken only by reflections from distant houses. William joined me and stood beside the railing. He did not ask whether I regretted what happened to Vanessa, Derek, or Susan. He knew the answer was more complicated than satisfaction. I had not set out to destroy them. I had asked them to stop. They answered by fabricating a death, imprisoning an innocent man, forging a will, stealing a home, draining a retirement account, and attempting to bury $4 million in hospital fraud. Every door they walked through had been opened by their own greed. I had simply stopped standing between them and the consequences. That was the truth about revenge that nobody in my family had understood. Revenge was not the moment Derek hit the ballroom floor, or the sound of handcuffs closing around Vanessa's wrists. It was not the guilty verdict, the prison uniform, or the magazine cover Susan saw while cleaning a transit station. Those images were dramatic, but drama fades. The sweetest revenge was waking without fear. It was knowing my bank accounts, my home, my work, and my future belonged to me. It was being able to hear my phone ring without wondering which relative wanted to take something. Derek and Vanessa remained in federal custody, serving the consequences of choices they once believed money could erase. Her letters stopped after our final prison visit. Susan never apologized without attaching a demand, so I maintained the boundary I had established. I did not celebrate her hardship, but I refused to rescue her from it. Compassion no longer meant volunteering to be consumed. The Scholarship Foundation supported 12 women studying forensic accounting and ethics. At the company, I strengthened reporting channels, created an ethics office, and made competence more important than family connections. William watched from the front row when the board approved my 5-year expansion plan without a dissenting vote. The life they tried to steal had become larger than anything they imagined. Almost a year after the phone call that started everything, I woke before sunrise. The Mercer Island estate was still quiet. I walked downstairs,
opened the kitchen blinds, and watched a pale line of morning light spread across the water. The digital clock on the oven changed from 6:59 to 700. For 1 second, I remembered Vanessa's voice announcing that my father was dead, and that I would receive nothing. I remembered Derek laughing. I remembered William sitting beside me, alive, exhausted, and holding his coffee like the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. The memory no longer controlled my breathing. It was simply evidence from a closed case. I poured fresh coffee into the same dark ceramic mug my father had used that morning. Footsteps sounded behind me. William entered in a robe, glanced at the clock, and raised one eyebrow. 7 o'clock, he said. Dangerous time for this family. Not anymore, I replied. He smiled and poured his own cup. We carried our coffee onto the terrace as the sun rose over Lake Washington. There were no police cruisers at the curb, no forged documents waiting in my inbox, and no voices demanding that I surrender my life to prove I loved them. My phone remained silent on the counter, and the silence felt like wealth. I had once been told that I would get nothing. In the end, I gained the things they could never steal: authority over my own choices, work that reflected my values, a father willing to face the truth, and a family built from respect instead of fear. Vanessa and Derek had tried to write my ending before they finished destroying themselves. They failed. I took a slow sip of coffee and watched the city brighten across the water. The hour that once marked betrayal now belonged to me. It held no panic, no grief, and no hunger for anyone else's approval. It held only stillness, freedom, and the quiet certainty that my life was finally, completely